Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. We have two amazing presenters today. We have Alexander Fedorov and Alfred Pang Ka. They would like to introduce themselves. First, Alexander's going to give a presentation for about 15 to 20-ish minutes, and then I'll open up for quick clarification questions. So like discussion questions we're going to do after hearing both of the presentations, but like I'll give you about 30 seconds. If you have any clarification questions in between, then that's the time. And if we don't have any clarification questions, we're going to move on to Alfred's presentation. We're going to listen to Alfred, and then I'm going to open up the floor to everyone for exciting and fun discussions. So please, Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Esther. It's a very big pleasure to be presenting this audience. And I'm a bit nervous because it's actually the first time me presenting my papers on religious education to religious education. It's a very specific audience, which makes me even more nervous. And my bio is, my name is Alexander Fedorov. I'm a sociologist of education, religion, and epistemology, focusing on Hong Kong and Asia. And I completed my PhD at the University of Hong Kong 2 years ago, and my dissertation was called Religious Education in Post-Colonial Hong Kong, Religious Plurality and Secularity. Yeah, and the talk today is a derivative of my dissertation, like one step further, which is like comparative research. I'm still talking very much about Hong Kong, but I'm making a comparative case of ethics and religious studies, which is an elective subject in Hong Kong. And I'll talk more about this in my slides. Here we go. Yeah, this is the title. Again, the title of my presentation today is Conscience and Moral Autonomy in Hong Kong Schools and East and Southeast Asian Comparison. Yes, and my point of departure was I wanted to make, already discussed it with this problem a bit with Alfred, is Hong Kong is very hard to compare with anything because it's so unique. So I was trying to come up with any point of departure. What can I compare to Hong Kong with? And I have a degree in Asian studies, which I finished probably 10 years ago. And one of the books which fascinated me during this Asian studies degree was Asian Power and Authority by Lucien Pai, a very famous French and American sinologist. And his idea was basically that in so-called Western society, there is a priority of freedom and individual conscience, while in Asia, in very general terms, conscience is not that critically important because in Asia, culturally, hierarchy is very important. And the step from this, my step from this, the idea is when you have too much power, you prioritize language of rights and freedom and individual conscience. When your fear is not enough power, you prioritize language of order, duties, and hierarchy. This is very basic step, very basic point of departure. And if we look at the idea of and the concepts of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, when I started to review literature for Hong Kong, I was fascinated of how much freedom of religion is discussed in collective terms. Because I grew up in a country called USSR, which does not exist anymore, fortunately. And in Russia in 90s, it was very anarchic time, but the idea of freedom was everywhere. And my childhood made me very libertarian. So I have a good instinct for freedom. And when I saw freedom of religion discussed in collective terms in Hong Kong, it was an aha moment. So we can begin with the concept. Freedom of conscience is always individual, and freedom of religion is can be individual and collective. In very simple terms, freedom of conscience is the right to believe, not to believe, to change beliefs, and basically to have whatever picture of the world you can hold. freedom of religion is much more collective, and it's can be individual right and collective right. And here I bring the synthesis of key literature and some core documents. And my own step was to try to conceptualize how to, because actually Russia is a good example, because if we look at the legal framework, Russia is a remarkably free country in terms of freedom of religion. But if we look at reality, it's I'm not going to talk about Russia much, but my idea here is to say that to name freedom of religion in the legal framework is absolutely not enough, and the level of operationalization is exactly where freedom of religion or freedom of conscience exists in practical terms. If you look at Hong Kong, Hong Kong is a very, very interesting case to think about freedom of religion and education, because Hong Kong has so many controversies. It would not be overestimation to say that the school system of Hong Kong has been built largely by Christian bodies of different denominations. And this is data from 2025. I don't think it changed in the last year. Hong Kong still has quite, even in the hangover time, slightly more than 50% of secondary schools and even more of primary schools have one or another religious affiliation. The system of Hong Kong, DSS schools, aided schools, it's not that important right here, but it's quite complex. And the idea is, in the literature after 2097, the key point of discussion was whether Hong Kong will save during the hangover and the return to the mainland China to one way or another, whether the system will collapse or whether it will sustain. In fact, it did sustain, yes, and it worked quite well. But the innovation came at not the organizational level, but at the level of curriculum and instruction. I will talk about this later. If we look at the level of legal framework, Hong Kong basic law, I'm very sorry, I'm busy 15 minutes. Hong Kong basic law has a remarkable description of freedom of religion, because Hong Kong basic law is quite tiny document, but it has 4 articles which describe religion bodies and the relationship between religion and education at this high level. Yeah, this already mentioned. This one I already mentioned. Yeah, and what is also interesting, I guess it's quite similar to Singapore, but Hong Kong is diverse, but Hong Kong religiously diverse. But Hong Kong cannot be called religious society by any measurement. And Hong Kong is the real religion of Hong Kong is probably education and money. These are like core religions of Hong Kong. And this explains how Hong Kong sector education work. Yes, and the consequences of this are many interesting consequences, but probably the key ones are religious schools are very, very prestigious, but not because we're religious, but because we're very good schools and because we're good brands and they have high reputation, which creates a paradox of like so many non-religious students want to study in religious schools, but they're not interested in religious education that much or at all. That's why any type of religious education in Hong Kong is probably cursed to be so-called like minor subject, to use Thomas Tse language. Yeah, but at the same time, Hong Kong is a remarkably tolerant society towards other beliefs, as long as they don't offend anyone. Yes, and in this paper, I had 2 research questions. The first is how students' freedom of conscience configured at the intersection of state and religion settlement and denominational schooling in East and Southeast Asian systems. And the second is specific about Hong Kong and Hong Kong subject ethics and religious studies. and what kind of language and what kind of invitations to reflection about religion it structurally has. Sorry for not reading this. It says much more clearly than I do. Yeah, and for case selections, my idea was to talk about Hong Kong substantially and to bring cases which are overlapping with the structure of religion and education in Hong Kong to some degree from different sides. Singapore is I'll talk about this later, but Singapore is a usual suspect in this degree with Hong Kong. South Korea is very interesting because South Korea also has a tradition of Christian, first of all, Protestant schools. Yes. Malaysia is interesting because it's almost it's comparable in terms of diversity with Singapore, but structurally it's very different, and Islam is the main religion there. And Thailand, the reason why I brought Thailand is because Thailand is remarkably tolerant society, and although arguably in Thailand religion is mostly integrated in the curriculum, but the problem here, first, it's Buddhism, and someone can argue it's like more mild, and the second, the problems with national identity. We don't really think about this when we talk about Thailand, but in Thailand, it's also a very important topic, especially in the southern provinces where cases of extremism and radicalism do exist. Yes, and I wanted real plurality, not only written in frameworks. And I wanted to, because these are too many languages and even my Cantonese is not that good, I wanted all the curriculums accessible in English to make textual level analysis of the curriculum. Yeah, so for methods, I analyze on two levels. I analyze at the level of legal framework, and the only case where I used data, like first-hand data, was Hong Kong, but for other cases, I do use secondary data and texts of curriculum documents and the framework policies. Already discussed cases a bit. Yes, analytical frame I already mentioned. First, the idea of diversion between freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, and the second, the language of civility and language of claimable protections of legal rights. Yes, and this the main these are the 4 articles from Hong Kong Basic Law which touch religion or education to some substantial degree. And as I already said, Hong Kong is remarkably secular at the language of curriculum policy and also the language of legal high order legal framework. Yes, this is basically, it protects very, very much.
You have 5 minutes left.
Okay, yeah. Ethics and Religious Studies is a curriculum which integrated pretty much all existing religious curricula before 1997. The problem was to remain some kind of level of operation of the bodies in the schools. Well, the idea was not to destroy the existing system and to integrate all the existing frameworks under one framework policy. But the problem here is that Buddhism and Christianity, especially Christianity, they are substantially implemented, and the framework promises the existence of Confucianism, Islam, and Taoism, but it already had 4 levels of revisions, and it always promises the new models to become implemented in the next stage and seems to be never happening. So it promises a lot and does quite little. Yes, and these are aims and the skills from them, from the policy here. I divided which are for conscience, which are for autonomy and agency. And my personal innovation at the analysis level, I analyzed the whole curriculum, all four editions, and I tried to pick very exactly civility language, which talks about coexistence, and very exactly is the autonomy language, which talks about individual conscience and moral autonomy. Yes, and the conclusion here, well, there are two patterns here. ERS is very full of language of dialogue, empathy, mutual respect, and almost never says anything explicitly about instruments, how to refuse, opt out, and not to be religious within the system, which creates quite interesting paradox. And here's the table where I basically summarize other cases together with Hong Kong and which space they create for freedom of conscience. Yes, and in Hong Kong, they often think that Hong Kong is very much exception, and it has so large tradition of denominational structure in schooling. And I definitely argue in my paper that this is quite normal for Asia. There are many cases of this, and Hong Kong is interesting not because it has so many religious schools, but how exactly religion is being implemented at the curriculum level. Yes, and here the discussion, I think I already have no time, but these are the questions I'm trying to raise in the paper and the discussion session. Yes, and the conclusion, yeah, I think I said pretty much all I wanted. Yeah, these are the references. Yeah, I'm happy for questions. Do you have questions now or in the end?
We're going to have discussions in the end after we hear from our second presenter. But if anyone has like a really quick clarification questions, you can please go ahead and ask. If not, we'll invite Alfred for the second presentation.
Okay, amazing.
Okay, if you could please stop sharing.
Yeah, this was easier for me.
Thank you. Why don't we give a hand to Alexander? And now, Alfred,
thank you.
Floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to this paper session by Alex and myself. I hope you're able to hear me. Just a quick introduction who I am. Graduated from Boston College with a PhD in theology and education. I'm a Singaporean citizen and I'm back home in Singapore. I'm an independent researcher and also an adjunct lecturer in a secular university, Department of Policy, Curriculum and Leadership. So whatever subjects I'm teaching right now has very little to do with theology as I go into leadership, ethics, and foundational learning. But at the same time, I engage as a consultant and trainer at workshops for parish leaders in adult faith formation, and also in the work of forming teachers and school leaders for Catholic schools. For this paper, I'm drawing on my experience as someone involved in the Catholic ministry here with LGBTQ people and also their families. I'm also the coordinator with Robin, who is here in the LGBTQ Allies Working Group in REA. So this is the title of my paper, Synodality as the Category of Harmony, Accompanying LGBTQ plus Catholics in Singapore. I'm just going to just outline some of the key points in my paper. What is my paper about? Basically, I am really focused on the pastoral accompaniment of LGBTQ plus Catholics in the context of what Pope Francis has called for. Pope Francis in October 2021 has called for the Catholic Church to be synodal. And what this means is that he's calling for the church, to a relational way of becoming more mission-oriented and participatory, a church that walks with all its members, especially and including those who have been marginalized. So Synodality, when we look at the global Catholic Church, has opened up a space for LGBTQ plus Catholics and Christians to break the silence of some of the pain, some of the hurt, as well as their hopes for the church. In the final document on synodality, what is striking for me is how the synodal church is called to be unity as harmony, with the Holy Spirit as the protagonist of the church's life. The accent here is not on unity in diversity, or even diversity in unity, but a harmonizing of differences in the spirit through mutual listening, dialogue, and community discernment as the people of God walking towards God's kingdom in union with all humanity. What I find striking about this language of harmony is that I stumbled into one of the papers by the Federation of Asian Bishops in the 1990s, where they have already articulated a theology of harmony. So my paper here is simply to retrieve this theology of harmony and consider how it can deepen an ecclesiology for a synodal church. But more importantly, my argument here is to make a case for how we can and should extend FABC's theology of harmony as a contribution of the Asian churches to the current synodal process for the pastoral accompaniment and greater inclusion of LGBTQ plus persons, with a focus on the work that I'm doing right now in Singapore. So here you have a kind of a map of FABC downloaded from their website. This is in 2022. Just to give you a sense of where it covers in terms of its membership. It covers roughly 28 territories. Yeah. And something that has been very interesting from the theologian Vimal Tiramana, he makes a point to highlight how what Francis has called for in the synodal process, elements within it have already found, have already been seeded, in the papers of FABC theology because of the Asian church's orientation towards mission with pilgrimage and dialogue as key pillars. What I want to just highlight in this slide for my paper is 3 insights that I'm drawing from FABC's theology of harmony that I find to be crucial in grounding the pastoral accompaniment of LGBTQ plus Catholics today in a synodal church. One is harmony proposed as an ecclesiological foundation for pastoral activity in the Asian churches. So the church is called to be a sacrament of harmony. Harmony becomes an Asian inflection for a theology of communion in how the Catholic Church imagines itself as Christ's body. I think the second point is the one that I really want to highlight also, is that contrary to many of us who think that harmony is about uniformity or conformity, I'm very struck by how the theology in it actually insists that harmony is not uniformity or conformity, but in fact it calls for justice that promotes an acceptance of diversity as richness and strength. So harmony here is opening up a space for diversity to be voiced, but it's also finding a way to hold the tension that comes from these voices that may seem in opposition to one another, but they also complement one another. So this brings me to the third point, where they situate the notion of harmony at the heart of being a dialogical church. And in the context of Asia, there is so pluralistic in terms of its culture and religion, dialogue is kind of spoken about in terms of a triple dialogue with people interculturally and interreligiously with a preferential option for the poor. And this is where I want to argue the preferential option for the poor today can and ought to be extended to those who experience their sexuality and gender identity as marginalized. I have given evidence and points in my paper that part of the synodal process that has led to recent FABC's documents that have in fact highlighted the plight of LGBTQ plus people as highly marginalized and facing varied forms of stigma and discrimination. What I really want to highlight here is how the focus is not on their sexual morality. The focus is very much on the relationships, their personhood, and their marginalization as a community, which for me is a significant shift. And even using the term LGBTQ plus, because for a long time, the Catholic Church prefers to use same-sex attraction. So for them to actually use that vocabulary is actually quite significant. So what I want to move on now is to, these are three insights that I feel ought to be, drawn out from FABC's theology of harmony to kind of ground a partial accompaniment of LGBTQ Catholics, and want to look at that in terms of the Singapore context. So I'm going to show you some pictures and also some headlines. I'm not going to read them all out, but just to, as you read the headlines, you get a sense of the tensions that are experienced on the ground in terms of the state of LGBTQ people in Singapore. What you see in these two images, really, in Singapore, we don't have Pride, though June is Pride Month, but what we do have since 2009 is what we call pink dot rallies, where people, regardless of your sexual orientation, would come together and, put on pink shirts, pink dresses in a flamboyant way, and to basically campaign for free love. And it has built its momentum up, and it has built its momentum to be one of the key groups that push for a repeal of 377A, which basically is a law inherited from the British that criminalizes sex between men. So now a couple of headlines. I hope this gives you a sense from the headlines, from the papers, the kind of tensions that are experienced on the ground, and how these tensions ought to be considered in light of ministry with LGBTQ plus Catholics in Singapore. A couple of things I want to highlight from our context here is that when we think about ministry with LGBTQ plus Catholics in Singapore, we need to situate it in light of Singapore being a city-state, multiracial, multi-religious, and just to echo Alexander's point, where maintaining social harmony is imperative to the country's stability for economic survival. So there is also the intercultural and interreligious sensitivity around sexuality and gender diversity, right? Something to take note here, because of the emphasis on maintaining social harmony, which isn't a bad thing, although the maintenance of social harmony is often enforced by law, it has created an environment safe enough for some important conversation to take place. But I also want to say, because of the strong need to maintain social harmony, to preserve social stability, the rights and equality of LGBTQ plus persons are very delicately navigated and negotiated. Oftentimes, it's within the system that they try to navigate their place. So Lynette Chua, who's a lawyer who writes about the mobilization of gay rights, would describe the way we navigate and negotiate these tensions as a form of pragmatic resistance. Now, notice also 377A was only repealed only in November 2022, very, very recent. Prior to that, although the law was there, it was never actively enforced, but it was still there. But even with the repeal, Singaporean society remains culturally conservative at large, in which being open about one's sexuality carries different stakes for different people. And you recall in my previous slide, there was one headline about teachers, whether they feel safe enough to be out. So especially for people in education, the stake is so much higher and riskier. So notice that it is in light of that when we think about ministry in our churches, especially at this time in a post-377A Singapore, the question for many churches, and including the Catholic Church, is how should we respond in a post-377A Singapore where LGBTQ plus issues continue to be contentious, emotionally charged, and polarizing. So it's an issue of polarization here. What I want to suggest here is, yes, that's where the theology of harmony becomes really important, to kind of reclaim it and also to deepen it and reimagine it, in terms of our church's ministry in our context here. So the synodal process in the Catholic LGBTQ plus ministry, I'm not going to go on a lot because I've written some bits of quite a bit of that in my paper. But when the synodal process happened, it also happened in the time where there was all these conversations around the repeal. But the key thing here is what the synodal process allowed. It allowed for a conversation to emerge from within the Catholic Church in Singapore as to how it could engage pastorally and sensitively with issues of sexual and gender diversity. Within the Catholic Church, then, it enabled a grace-filled space for members in the ministry to be seen and heard more openly as church and not just part of it. And to be honest, in the context of my ministry here, it is probably for the very first time where for many of them, they broke the silence around the hurt, the anxieties, the pain, but also their hopes, right? It created a moment for them to come out, even if it's not to the public square that openly in the state of Singapore, but at least within the church, there was a space for them to name who they are and how they would invite the church to see them. And what in my paper I want to suggest is how synodality isn't simply an event. Synodality is practiced. And the practice that in some way constitutes a pedagogy of harmony with listening at its heart. The point about harmony I want to make here, which is a point that Pope Francis also makes, is that it makes room for nuance and balance with a view of how best we as the LGBTQ plus community can witness to God's reign as church in this present moment. Remember the point I make about polarization. There's a tendency on these issues for people to be engaged in the tug of war. I'm liberal, I'm conservative. And the result of that is that we miss out a whole spectrum of voices in between, where people don't fall into either. They don't want to get political about it. They just simply want to find a space to belong where they can still pray and be with church with people. So from synodality as well, in my ministry, we have basically taken this pastoral approach of generous spaciousness, which is a term that I'm drawing from Van der Waals' work. For generous spaciousness, the starting point for ministry is not sexual morality. The starting point for general spacious, the starting point for LGBTQ plus ministry is in the spiritual formation, inherent in the experience of exploring intimate relationship with God and with each other as we wrestle through these difficult questions and challenges. So it is actually engaging in discipleship formation and spiritual deepening. And where it gets formed is not about championing one's right, just protest and shout, but really in that difficult process of dialogue and the dialogue towards harmony as a crucible that begins to form people's lives. So that's the approach that we are taking. So
You
this
have
approach
about
in
3 minutes,
some way
right?
bears an openness to the spirit to move beyond the polarization over issues of sexual diversity in our churches and society. The spirit blends the prophetic with wisdom in harmony that makes room for nuance, balancing the diverse voices of LGBTQ plus persons with a view of how best we can witness to God's reign as church in this present moment from within our particular social, cultural, political, and economic realities that both constrain and enable. Of course, not without tensions, especially with this whole idea of harmony, and I would be very, very interested to hear what people have to say and also be in a dialogue with Alexander, because one of the issues you pointed out in your paper was on the limits of talk on harmony. Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we give a hand to Alfred? Thank you for this amazing presentation. Now the floor is open. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand, ask, or you can leave some in the chat. I will make sure to have an eye on the chat and read it out. Yes, Cheryl, please.
Thank you, Esther. This is just a clarification question for Alfred. Near the beginning, just thank you again, Alfred. That was a wonderful presentation for you. Near the beginning, you clarified unity and harmony, and you expressed quite distinctly what unity was not, was harmony was not. And I didn't get down exactly what you said, but you were quite precise about clarifying what they were not. Do you remember what you said?
Yeah, because I wrote it down.
Oh, good.
No, I was struck when I read the final document on the Synod on Synodality, where the subsection in the paper was unity as harmony. It wasn't worded as unity in diversity or diversity in unity, but it was harmony. And so I thought it was striking because you can have diversity, but the emphasis here was on the harmonization of these differences. And Pope Francis would make reference to it as the spirit itself is the harmonizer, is the protagonist in trying to bring this. So I'm just making a point there that to me, I thought that it was a very subtle distinction. I thought was not just simply unity and harmony and unity and diversity, diversity and harmony, but or diversity in unity, which we are very familiar with, but it's just the word harmony and harmonizing.
Okay. To clarify, if you look musically where you have harmony and you hear the distinct tones, is that an analogy?
Yeah. So you hear the distinct tone. It's not only the distinct tone, it's how the distinctive tones echo each other.
Right,
And
how they
even
come
in the
together.
opposition, that can be complementary.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah. I can say more,
Thank
but
you.
I'll just see how
Thank
the
you.
conversation goes. Because for me, personally, when I wrote this paper, I was very much struck by the notion of harmony from the FABC's theology, because I've always thought about harmony as conformity because of the way we think about harmony. And I didn't stumble into the FABC paper. Well, I didn't read the FABC paper until I read a paper. Interestingly, Alexander, you may be interested in this, was somebody called Holly Ching, who wrote a paper on civic deliberation in citizenship education. And she was drawing on a Confucian notion of harmony. And she basically looked at Confucian notion of harmony as critical balance and inviting diversity. You know, it isn't trying to overcome opposition, but it is trying to create that balance, which is organic and fluid and changing. And then I found that in the FABC's paper where they were trying to get at that organic, dynamic nature. Yeah.
Thank you, Alfred.
Any other questions? What you found interesting? Yes, Yen.
Hi, thank you both for your presentation. It's wonderful. But my question for Alexander, I really appreciate when you kind of distinguish between the culture, and you emphasize that Asian culture, like in Hong Kong, everything mostly in order and hierarchy relationship. So I am wondering, is that in your observation, is that anything change in hierarchy practice when in this context, contemporary context in Hong Kong, because it's kind of changing world now with a lot of things going on. So any change in cultural practice regarding hierarchical context in Hong Kong?
Thank you very, very much for this question. I really appreciate it. And I've been thinking a lot about hierarchy and harmony, actually. Thank you, Alfred, for raising this point over and over again from slightly different perspective. But the way I can totally relate to the idea and distinction. I've been thinking a lot about this topic, and my personal opinion, if you ask my personal opinion, this is area of speculation. I don't have any data. But my personal opinion that in Hong Kong and probably in Singapore too, I would say, if I put it this way, the level of culture, like Confucius values, like hierarchy, it's so deep. It's much deeper than political environment. It's much deeper than economical change. I mean, now in Hong Kong, everyone is talking about AI, people losing jobs, and this is like topic number one. And everyone is discussing this. But even like if something dramatic goes into society, the idea of hierarchy is so deep, in my opinion. It's a cultural level. It's impossible to change a person on the cultural level in years. I mean, we see Asian people who moved abroad and studied for like 20 years in Western universities and returned, and they changed, but very often they changed remarkably little. So my personal opinion, I don't see that big change in terms of hierarchy. And I don't think it's possible to change society as Hong Kong and something fundamental as this. But someone can say probably something different.
Could I respond to that? I mean, yeah, if I may respond, yeah. No, you are right, Alex. I think in many of the Asian cultures, as even in Singapore today, there is still, the hierarchical culture that basically the deference to authority, respect your elders, so on and so forth, right? But I do think in Singapore, I think generationally, there's also shifting, in terms of the kind of teacher-student relationship I even have in classrooms today, where it's gone the other way, where students are far more vocal, right? At the same time, on the question of hierarchy, I make a distinction between hierarchy and dominance, because I do think when we mean by hierarchy, my question is, what is the hierarchy for? And is it to create situations of governance that create conditions for some stability to take place? But there is the danger where that becomes dominance, and then depending on which generation you're from, it may keep you, from saying certain things, and to keep harmony, right? So to your point, that's where I think that there's some limits to the talk of harmony. But my point is also, these limits also point us to the need to reclaim a more expansive notion of harmony from the sources, philosophical sources, our tradition, our religious sources, our spiritual sources. Yeah. So.
I would agree with this. And also, I think, I was thinking when you were saying this idea, I think that hierarchy is becomes like most clear at the level of responsibility and the priorities. I mean, when person decide what's their like ethical responsibility, what's more important, freedom or teacher? For me, question is never question. For me, freedom is number one. Teacher, I don't care about teacher if it violates my freedom, because my freedom is the most important thing, and not only my freedom, your freedom, because I treat you exactly the same way as I treat you are. This is my idea, but it's kind of radical. I mean, if I put something like this, I'm also oversimplifying right now because I want to prioritize clarity once again. But if I say this point that way to Asian person, whatever, ideal Asian person, I'm unlikely to be understood at the level of values. But right now, I flew from Hong Kong, and right now I'm in Amsterdam. If I just talk to a stranger this language in Amsterdam, they will understand me 100%. Because for this society, this is very libertarian society. For this society, this is the top priority. Yeah, this is how I see it. Yeah. And if I may, I have a question for you, Alfred.
Please go ahead.
Yeah.
You were saying that Singapore is largely a traditional society in values. And I think before the conference began, they spoke a bit about Hong Kong. Liz Jackson, who was my supervisor, and Alfred knows here. My question is, of course, you don't know Hong Kong. And in your estimation, which society do you think is more traditional, Hong Kong or Singapore? Because we always compare Hong Kong and Singapore. I would say Hong Kong is more liberal.
I wouldn't want any
Slightly.
comparison because the context is different and the histories are
Of
different.
course.
But I will say what both of us share is that both places are really good at making money. It's the affluence. It's the affluence that is shifting all these. It's consumerism that is killing moral conscience, if you ask me. If I can throw in something there, it's really, the pragmatism, that is going on. The pragmatism that would prevail over rights, the pragmatism that will prevail over relationships. And so part of me in Singapore is really trying to challenge that very, very pragmatic. Nothing wrong with being practical and pragmatic, but when that pragmatism ends up in a way that everything is calculated, everything is measured, that creates a lot of stress. So I'm not going to say which is more traditional, whether Singapore or Hong Kong. And it also depends on which generation you're talking about and which groups. But I do think for both countries, we are known as the tiger economies. We were meant to perform economically. So I do think that's an economic dimension. Why could gays be in Singapore? Because they contribute to the economy. There's one piece there, which we don't always talk a lot about, yeah. Let's hear from the rest. We can go on and on, but I'm mindful of time. We have 3 minutes. I really would like to hear from people, different voices. What struck you? John, I know. I knew you would unmic yourself. Yes, John.
Can either of you talk more about harmony as critical balance? I really like that.
That's a difficult one because I don't think we see harmony as balancing different voices. I got this idea from Holy Ching, who actually draws on the work of a Confucianist philosopher, Li Chen-yang. And the idea is that the simplest way to put it is to hold opposites in tension and the creative tension. So basically to sit with that tension and allow ourselves to be creative within it. I'm practicing Tai Chi. I just started learning Tai Chi, and there was one particular, gesture was like putting my hand out like that, and my instructor came to kind of push against me, and she said, resist, but stand still. And then she said, this is balance. I was very much struck by that in the sense that harmony does call for resistance, but it's a resistance that doesn't turn into the offensive. It borrows that energy and gives it back. So it's always constantly moving. So back, how do we apply it here? There are many decisions that I find myself having to make in ministry here where I would have loved to push it further. But for now, this is what we can do. And let's hold it for now. And then when the situation changes, we change and move with it. So it's like water, trying to kind of, if you can't go through it, you kind of go around it. But you still have water trying to get at it until one day something, that the water kind of pushes it through. But meanwhile, you still have water that goes around it. And there am I finding ways to how do I go around this, not on my own, but within the institution, are there things I can begin to draw on? But the aim is never to. What was very interesting was recently there was a radio interview by the person who started Pink Dot. And Pink Dot basically is like the Pride version in Singapore. For many people in the Catholic Church, the ones I meet, they are very, very wary of these Pink Dot activists. They think they are championing for rights. But when what I hear from the radio interview from one of the pioneers of Pink Dot was that they really had in mind to set that up to unify people. It was not to disrupt people. And so the strategy then was, it may sound to people today to be like, what, you did that, is to get allies on board and get allies to speak for them. Because that was the only thing they could do at that point. And then so the advertisements were around, did you know a gay friend? Which for some settings, that's terribly offensive. But for them, it was the only way for them to get the discourse out. But the end of it was really trying to be creative to get people on board, and it's for unifying. It is not to champion my right over yours. The rights discourse is still there, but the aim of it was to change the hearts and minds of people. And so what I begin to look at the ministry that I'm in is true. It's really about how do we minister with LGBTQ people to deepen a sense of authentic, credible discipleship, that when you meet us, you get a surprise, and that it begins to change something within. So at the end of it, nobody sees us as LGBT or Q anymore. We're just part of church. And that is the starting point. Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm just giving analogy because I find it very hard to actually describe that critical balance, but it's just these different metaphors and analogies kind of help me.
I just say one word. There's an exercise in Theater of the Oppressed where I have to change my action and behavior into yours, and you have to change yours into mine, but not too quickly, as if I'm giving mine up, and not too slowly, as if I'm hanging too hard onto mine.
Yeah. Yes.
Interesting. Thank you. Mary left in the chat tensegrity, tension, and integrity, holding opposing forces together, respect for their individual integrities. Do you want to talk a little more about it?
I think we're out of time, but that's actually an architectural phrase from Buckminster Fuller. The most stable structures, he argued, he's the geodesic dome guy, are built this way. Opposing forces of elongation and compression was what he was talking about. But when you were talking about critical harmony as critical balance, that's what made me think of it. But anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this session. It was really interesting. Thank you for all the conversation. Why don't we give a hand to our two presenters again? Thank you.